Hello, gentlemen.
How's it going?
Hi, Yasmina.
Good. Thank you so much for participating today and for hosting this Fireside Chat.
Thanks for having me.
No,
Look here, why don't we get started with why do startups fail? Both of you talk a lot about startup failure rates. What would you say are the biggest contributors to startups or products in general failing?
I think that typically what we find is that most products fail simply because we fail to, not because we fail to build what we set out to build, but because we waste a lot of time along the way, a lot of time, money, effort building the wrong product. And I find that the biggest contributor for that failure is this thing that I've seen a lot, and that is entrepreneurs, when they get hit with an idea, they typically fall in love with their solution, something I like to call awesome. And sometimes that awesome is truly awesome for a lot of people, but more often than not, it's not. And in many ways, that's what I attribute as one of the main contributors to going astray and building that wrong product.
I'll tell a story. When I first became an entrepreneur, I had an experience that I see with a lot of entrepreneurs, which is that every single thing that I saw, every person I talked to, every research report I read, left me more and more convinced that my idea was absolutely brilliant. In fact, when I first became an entrepreneur, I wrote a 40-page, unbelievably beautiful, if I do say so myself, business plan, and it was really a work of prose beauty. If anyone still has a copy, it would make you weep to read. It was so good. And as Ash is saying, the problem wasn't that it wasn't a well-written or well-conceived business plan. It's just that many of the things that we believed about the business were, actually speaking, incorrect. And so we kind of got to have the first half of the movie, The Social Network experience. Unfortunately, not the parts where we made so much money we got to sue each other.
Yep.
Great, thank you. How about why lean? How does lean help improve these failure rates?
So I find that that lean helps you break that big vision that we're kind of talking about into its component parts, and the actual implementation of how you do that is that's more of a solution. But the principle there is breaking that big vision into its component parts, and once you have that, lean gives you a set of further principles and techniques by which you can then systematically test that vision. And more specifically, I'm now talking about the business model. So identifying what makes that business model tick, prioritizing what to work on, and then having a process for systematically tackling that. That's what I see kind of the lean startup movement and these processes and techniques helping towards raise those odds of success. Eric, would you like to add anything?
Oh, sure. I was just going to say, just for those who are not familiar with the history, the word lean in lean startup comes from lean manufacturing, which is a system of production that goes back to the Toyota production system and started in Japan in the 20th century. And this was a really breakthrough way of looking at a business, to really evaluate everything that we do through the eyes of the customer in order to figure out which activities that we're doing actually create value for the company and for the customer and which ones are waste. And just having that perspective was a really big breakthrough, because it turned out that customers don't care, how much inventory you hold in a factory or something like that. They only care about getting a high-quality finished product. And so when we try to adapt those ideas for entrepreneurship, we have to confront the thing that Ash was talking about, which is that in a startup, we want to look at everything we do through the eyes of a customer, but we don't even know who our customer is yet. And so whose eyes do we use to evaluate the work that we do? What we have developed in Lean Startup is to view learning about how to build a sustainable business as the value that startups create. That discovery is the value. And so we can reframe everything we do as entrepreneurs to ask what creates value and what's waste. Everything we do that helps us learn what we need to learn, that's value creating, that's important, that's worth doing. And everything else, even if it makes us feel good, even like writing a business plan or putting out a press release or trying to tell everyone how great our company is, those activities are actually all waste. And the really scary part is oftentimes even building more features, actually building the product itself, polishing it, making it quote-unquote better, that actually can be a form of waste, because if we do work that customers don't care about, we don't actually learn anything from that. And so the kind of mechanics of Lean Startup is about driving down our cycle time so we get the feedback that we need from customers, from the market, test our hypotheses not just rigorously, but also as quickly as we can.
Let's now turn to biggest takeaways. What would you say are the biggest startup lessons both of you learned while applying Lean in your respective companies?
Okay, so I guess here I can jump into a little story. For me, the biggest takeaway was really starting with a problem worth solving, and really honing into what is that, what is it about you, what are the constraints that you have, and what is the purpose that you have with the product that you want to go build, the vision that you want to go realize. And so the story that I'm going to tell is one about the last company that I just exited. And so I built that company several years ago with really just a spark of an idea, and it was really a technology play. As I alluded to early on, I fell into the trap of falling in love with the solution. And we had it, like most first-time entrepreneurs, we were doing it completely in stealth, didn't want to tell anyone. And despite our best attempts at keeping that a secret, competitors slowly came on. So this for background, this was a private social network that we were building before social networking was even a term well known. But pretty soon Friendster came out, and a whole slew of others came out, and so that didn't keep the idea from getting out. But aside from that, our first attempt at identifying the customer segment we were going after failed, and despite that, we kept building more and more. So this is going to what Eric was saying, is that we don't tend to give up. We tend to continue searching for that business plan. But I will say that, or that business model that works. But I will say that over time, in this particular instance, we became more of a solution looking for a set of problems, and the legacy of what we had built in many ways became a limiting constraint. And so even though we had varying levels of success, we found some hills, we found some local maxima products, and we had sustainable cash flow, it really was something that we kind of got stuck after a while. And so my biggest takeaway with the new stuff that I'm doing now, with the new company that I've built now, is taking a completely different tack, which is looking at it more holistically from the problems I want to solve, and specifically the customer segments that I want to interface with. Because I found that you can iterate your way from one hill to another. You can move to a completely different customer segment, but that may not be a sustainable plan for you as an entrepreneur. And so for me, it's important to start with that purpose, or that point of where you're going. And so for me, with the second company that I built, I tend to fall in love with the problem that I was solving rather than any particular solution, and really let the solutions just present themselves, or layer those solutions on incrementally as needed. Eric, would you want to talk about your big takeaway?
Yeah, gosh, the big takeaways come from the big failures, and so therefore there's an embarrassment of riches to choose from. I was thinking about, we talk a lot about science in Lean Startup, and part of what we're trying to do is make the process of entrepreneurship more scientific. And one of the things I've learned traveling on the world talking about this is that when people hear that, it conjures up a very rigid, very mechanical, and I think very erroneous idea of what science is. And that has to do with the fact that the way we teach science in schools, I think, is quite poor. We teach it as this kind of formula for reproducing experiments that other people have done, and we forget that science is one of humanity's most creative pursuits. In fact, someone was recently criticizing me and said, hey, you can't turn entrepreneurship into a science. If entrepreneurship became a science, then anybody could do it. And I was thinking, that doesn't make sense. Science is a science, and very few people are capable of doing it. It's actually incredibly difficult. So, what does it mean to make something into a science? It means that we treat everything that we do as if it was an experiment designed to help us learn something. And so, it's not that we have to kind of, like a lot of people when they first get into this, they want to spend a lot of time basically creating a new kind of business plan, using a business model canvas or doing something to kind of write down all their assumptions, and they want to spend a lot of time analyzing and talking to customers, and that's all, perfectly valid work. But then they often think, okay, I do all my analysis, I talk to some customers, and then I move into building my product. And now I'm done learning, I'm done experimenting, which is actually exactly backwards. When you finally build something and put it out there, that's actually one of the first times you conduct a true, actual experiment. It's just that the experiment is designed to teach you whether all that analysis you did before actually makes sense or not. And the real key question is, will customers behave the way I hypothesized? And the biggest problem with doing science, and this is true in the laboratory and in startups too, the hardest thing is to make a tangible, specific prediction ahead of time about what is supposed to happen. Because as soon as you do that, you've now created conditions that could allow you to fail. And most people are terrified of failure. But if you really believe what Ash and I have been saying, that learning is the most important unit of progress, then the only way to learn is to fail. That's the prerequisite for learning. So we're actually trying to set people up deliberately to provoke failure quickly and make those failures productive so that they lead to the most learning possible.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I know I think what you just said is the whole application of the scientific method. I often hear people saying, well, startups are not a perfect science. In the real world, it's hard to really take that rigidly and that rigorously. But I think that in many ways is also some of the challenges. Is kind of the hows of being disciplined, of doing those falsifiable hypotheses up front, and then holding yourself accountable to them. And I would like to ask some more questions if we get time towards the end, but I can see the audience has some questions coming in. So maybe, Yasmina, if you can help us just sort through these or maybe direct them at us, and we'll kind of go down that list first.
Sounds great, Ash. Alrighty, we do have several questions that have come in. Thank you very much, folks, for sending them in. And we'll just take them in the order that they have been received. First one is from Tim Coulter. The Lean Startup methodology places a lot of emphasis on treating vision, strategy, and product as separate elements. In one of your Intuit video interviews, you described the real-world scenario faced by many of us, where we have a brilliant idea in which all three elements are fused. Do you have a technique for decomposing a concept in order to isolate the characteristics that form the core of its vision, which presumably means that the remainder is open to experimentation and validation? Big question.
Yeah, I love that question.
I'll
jump in since I think he's referring to a video that I did with Intuit, so it's partially my fault for causing the confusion in the first place. Well, just for those who haven't seen the video and are not as familiar, I do think of a startup as composing three key elements: the vision, which is the foundation, the immutable core of what we're trying to do; the strategy, which is our specific roadmap, business model, hypothesis about how to reach customers; and then the product itself, which is the thing that customers experience. And when we change one of those three things, we have kind of terminology for that. When you change the product, that's just an optimization. That's just trying to make the product a little bit better. We do that all the time. Rarely, but still an important part of the process, we will change the strategy. We call that a pivot. And the key point of a pivot is a pivot is a change in strategy without a change in vision. And that's really important because we're trying to leverage what we have learned in the initial products that we've tried to build, in the initial strategic business model, whatever we were doing, to try to learn, hey, this isn't what's working. Here's another path, another route to get to the final destination. And so if you think about Google with a mission statement to organize the world's information, you have to remember that making money through the search engine was not their initial plan. They were going to make money through selling those yellow search appliance boxes they were going to sell into enterprise. I hope everybody remembers that. And when that turned out to be really one of the worst ideas ever, they didn't give up on organizing the world's information. They made a pivot into a different way of making money, a different business model that ultimately led to AdWords and their breakout success. So now the question is, when we have a vision, we as entrepreneurs, when we experience what we're trying to do, we see the future. It doesn't come through labeled, this bit is the strategy, this bit is the product, this bit is the vision. It comes through as this crystal clear idea of everything. We can see the product and all its many features. We know exactly who the customer is. We see exactly how it's going to be used, and we see ourselves always on the cover of a magazine, demonstrating our breakthrough idea. And, I'm from San Francisco, so sometimes people think what I have to say is a little bit woo-woo and new age, so I apologize in advance. I actually think that the coolest thing about entrepreneurship is that it is actually a process of self-discovery. That it is only when you fail that you actually have the opportunity to discover what your vision really is. Because when we have that moment of crystal clarity, when we see the future, we're not really required to make any trade-offs. We can kind of have it all. Our product is low cost, and it's beautiful, and it appeals to all different segments at the same time, and our distributors and partners really like us, and all the other industries bow out of the way to make room for our product. All kinds of ridiculous, actually, things are present in that vision. But when we try to put a specific strategy into play, then we discover what the real constraints, the real trade-offs are. And this is what's so cool about it. No two people would experience the moment of a pivot the same, because it's a matter of judgment and vision and what do you really care about. So I've told the story a lot, and this is tells sort of a lot of detail in my book about a company I built called IMVU, this 3D avatar company, and we went through a very important pivot where we realized that instead of being an add-on to other instant messaging networks, we had to build our own standalone network and eventually our own social network. And if you think about that pivot, what we were confronted with was a choice we had to make. We could say, all right, either we interoperate with these other people, but we have to ditch the 3D avatar part of the business, or we're going to go all in on the 3D avatar part of the business and really let go of all the interoperable kind of connecting with your friends kind of stuff. And I don't think there's a right answer to that decision. I mean, when we made that pivot in 2004, we could easily have decided, you know what, hanging out with your friends online, that's going to be a pretty big business, because just down the street from us in Palo Alto was a tiny little company called Facebook, concluding that exact same thing. So we could easily have gone in the Facebook direction, and maybe we would have made a lot more money. But what we really cared about, we discovered in this process, was the particular kind of intimate online engaging communication that 3D avatars enable. And so we made a pivot that was appropriate for us. So we actually discovered that it was the avatars which were core to the vision, and the social networking and IM bits that were just the strategy that we were able to let go. And that process of learning to tell those two apart is actually one of the most important things that entrepreneurs do.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric. Our next question is from John, and John asks if you have any tips for solo entrepreneurs without co-founders.
Okay, I'll maybe take a stab at that one. So I kind of redefine the job of an entrepreneur slightly differently. I look at the true job of an entrepreneur being one of systematically de-risking their startup or product idea over time. So when you first start out, you get hit by this idea. You're probably the only one that thinks it's a great idea. And so part of attracting the team, the co-founder, customers, investors, advisors, all of that requires you to systematically de-risk your idea. And so typically when I do some of these workshops, I often am hit by two kinds of people. They're the technical founder types who say, I've built this great solution, but I don't have any sales or marketing skills in me, so I need to go find that business co-founder, and I'm stuck. How can you help me? And then I find the opposite story where you've got the business founders with all the great ideas, but they need someone to go execute the solution before they can get any further. And my answer to both of them is almost the same, which is the famous big blank, get out of the building and really start learning about whether your idea is, if other people other than yourself think the idea is good. And you can actually get pretty far, and I challenge a lot of people in these workshops to actually go and even sell their products without having to write a single line of code, without having to build all this stuff, because you can go and in small scale be able to test a lot of these things. And once you get that, if you get 10 customers willing to pay, if you're a business person, you might be able to get a technical co-founder to then jump in with you, or you could come up with some creative arrangement to actually move that forward. But the other job of the entrepreneur is, again, then creating the right set of resources to be able to move that idea forward, and that becomes that next obstacle, which is if you get that early signal that you're onto something, how do you really create that right environment? And that is kind of the second thing that one has to overcome. So they're not any easy answers, but I do think that it should start with that concept of de-risking what you're doing and try to communicate it better to the people around you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ash. We'd just like to remind our audience, folks, if you have a question for Eric or Ash, please send that into the group chat. Just open that widget on your widget tray, type in your question, send it in. We are so lucky today to have Eric and Ash on the webcast, two men sharing their generous time with us today, very successful, famous entrepreneurs, so ask them your questions. All righty, let's continue. Question from Michael Bernstein. What are the latest things you've learned about applying lean?
Well, one thing I've learned is that the stuff that I think is the most impactful, certainly from the book that I just wrote, is the stuff that has been the hardest for people to digest because it doesn't fit very well on a bumper sticker. So a lot of the most famous ideas from Lean, things we've been talking about so far, pivot, minimum viable product, get out of the building, they make excellent bumper stickers. There's actually quite a few places you can get T-shirts with those slogans on them, and those concepts are super important, and I don't want to take anything away from that. But there's actually a whole set of kind of next things that you need to do beyond just testing your initial idea, running that initial experiment. That's about building a business that actually can grow and scale for the long term. And so one of those concepts is something I call engines of growth. And as I'll describe this as best I can here on the phone, you'll understand why this does not fit on a bumper sticker and therefore why people are not as excited about some other things. But I think it's really quite important. And so this is kind of my latest thinking is that the kind of growth we want to get as entrepreneurs is what we call sustainable growth. And sustainable growth happens when new customers come into our product as a result of the actions of past customers. Anything else is really unsustainable. If we do a big PR blitz, a big Super Bowl ad, that's just a one-time action. But if we can take the revenue we make from past customers and reinvest that in advertising, that's the paid engine of growth, then as that engine turns over, the more money we make, the more customers we get, and it builds. Similarly, if we're trying to build a viral business where new customers act as the infection vector to get other customers to join, then if you think about that viral loop turning over and over again, the faster the loop turns over, the higher the viral coefficient, the more customers will gain. And there's a third one called the sticky engine of growth, which is for high engagement type businesses. In each of those three engines, there's really one critical number that says how fast the engine turns. Paid engine of growth is about marginal profit per customer. Viral engine of growth is about viral coefficient, etc. And I think, and this is the thing that I think is both very controversial and also a lot of people just missed it, I think those mathematical equations give us the ability to say that product market fit, that elusive thing that you kind of know it when you see it, that your product finally finds traction, the market starts to engage in that hyper-growth behavior we all want, that hockey stick. I think we can define product market fit mathematically as a quantitative value, and therefore we can measure as we're going whether we are actually making progress towards product market fit or not. Now, does that sound like a great bumper sticker? Try to cram all that into a tiny font? No, it doesn't. But that the math behind that and the concept of really modeling our growth based on these kind of causal theories of how customers are supposed to behave, I have found that to be incredibly helpful in the startups that I've worked with.
Sure, and since you brought that up, Erica, maybe I'll ask kind of a follow-up question or kind of just dig deeper, because I know when I read your engine of growth concept in the book, I thought it was phenomenal, but my first reaction was it can't be that simple. There has to be a fourth engine of growth, and I really struggled hard to find a fourth, and I wasn't able to. But I will say that some things that I do find people struggling, and you kind of touched on it lightly in your book, is that oftentimes multiple engines of growth can apply, and it's like any hypothesis. Even you guys with IMVU pivoted your engine of growth or changed it kind of along the way. So I guess maybe you can talk a little bit about how does one kind of approach that. So do you measure? So do you have a hypothesis and you measure it and you focus on that one, and then you tweak? So I'll give you a real example. So many SaaS businesses can benefit both from a sticky engine of growth and a paid.
Yeah.
So sticky in the sense of they've got a recurring service, so the longer they keep people, the more lifetime value, and that will grow just naturally from there. Now, they could also spend money in advertising and try to make more users enter the funnel. And I've hit this with many people, and the question they always ask is, which one should I double down on? Should I do sticky or should I do paid? So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you make that determination, even just using that specific example.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. In fact, I was literally just this morning on a call with a European startup that has this exact conundrum, and right now, on a pretty small base, they're growing at a reasonable clip. But because they don't know which engine of growth to focus on, they're having trouble figuring out where should they really double down, what kind of marketing and product marketing should they be doing. And I really believe that the right thing to do is to focus on one engine of growth and try to make it work. And then if it doesn't work, pivot. And the reason that's so important is that the hardest thing I find, like when I'm in a startup board meeting, especially when I was the entrepreneur presenting my metrics, I would come into a board meeting, I'd be like, hey, let me show you a funnel chart, let me show you some conversion metrics. Hey, look, I found a graph that's up and to the right in Google Analytics, I must be doing a good job. newsflash, there's always at least one graph that's up and to the right in Google Analytics, so you can always say you're doing a good job even if you're totally screwing up. The problem I had was, how do I know what's good? So, I remember a board meeting where I was bragging about having 60% retention, 1 month retention in my product. So if a customer used my product today, 60% probability they're still using it a month from now. And one of my board members said, well, I heard that such and such other product has 80% retention, so 60% sucks. And I was like, oh yeah, well, I heard that some other product has only 30% retention, so 60% is great. It's like this conversation was 100% not productive because we couldn't agree on whether 60% was good or bad. Picking an engine of growth, I think, helps you really, really get clear about that. If you're trying to make the sticky engine of growth work, 60% retention is just not going to cut it. Sure. That means that every month you're losing 40% of your user base that has to be replaced to some other source. And nobody has 40% word-of-mouth growth. It's just unheard of. Mm-hmm. So if you're in that situation and you say, oh, no, I want to go sticky, it becomes very clear. We have to drive that retention rate up. That's our number one imperative. But if you try that, and I happen to know a lot of companies that try to get the retention up, and they can't get it to the 90% that you need to really make that engine of growth work. You might say, well, 60% retention means we have a pretty good lifetime value. If you think about, product companies, if you think about a dating site where long-term retention is not the goal, if you're long-term retained on a dating site, that means the dating site is a mega failure because customers want off the dating site as soon as possible. So that's a classic thing where the retention rate will be something like, 40, 50%. Customers will stay for a few months and then they'll go. You'll get the monthly fee from them during that time. And you make a pretty reasonable amount of money per customer. That creates an opportunity to invest in advertising using that lifetime value. When you make the pivot into the paid engine of growth, that creates a completely different imperative about what to focus on. It's like everything possible to both increase LTV and decrease cost to acquire. The reason why it's important to do one at a time is that a lot of companies that are struggling with this question, the thing that they learn when they try one and then the other is that neither engine of growth will work. There's a lot of great businesses out there that just don't have the opportunity to do hypergrowth because market conditions aren't right. The product isn't actually that good. The level of product market fit is only mediocre. And if that's true, you want to find that out as soon as possible because that calls for a more dramatic pivot than just engine of growth. And so I think if you don't focus on one and then the other and kind of exhaust each one, you can wind up in the land of the living dead because you have mediocre numbers that are, they could even be up and to the right. Gross numbers could all be up and to the right. The key numbers could be improving a little bit each month. But if you're not really making progress, you got to call it a day and try something different. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Eric.
Very good. Thank you so much. Our next question is from Maggie. Maggie asks and says she's seen a lot of startups out there developing products for audiences that they can't relate with. How important is it to have people on your team that can identify with the customer?
Maybe I'll take that because I touched on that a little bit. So I do believe that the putting yourself or getting inside the minds of the customer, and so we look at kind of many people use this as the anti-example. A company like Apple that people look on the outside and say they don't do, they don't follow any of these techniques. But I will say that one thing they do quite well is get inside the minds of their customers, and they understand their customers quite well. So I will say that is an advantage that you have if you can relate to your customers and or supplement that. And I've been in situations where one of my radical pivots, because I had this solution looking for a problem, was to go and try to address the wedding photographer market. And I'm already married, and so wedding is one of those things that you don't quite do, or you shouldn't. At least I wouldn't want to be doing those every so often. So that was not necessarily a place that. So there were 2 things. I was not hanging around weddings at my point of my career, and then the other thing is I was not that big into photography. It just so happened that was something that the technology could be used quite effectively to do. But we ran into a challenge there, and for me to be able to kind of learn from my customers, I really had to go, one, be able to talk to them, be able to kind of understand who they are, hang out where they are, and those were the things that over time I realized that I was not the best one to do, and I started the search of finding someone on my team who could help supplement that. So I do think that tends to be something that can be limiting. Now, I will also say that in the very early days, you don't quite know who that customer segment is, so that shouldn't also be the the only limiting factor to take into account.
Thank you, Ash. Our next question is from Jacob. Jacob would like to know, what are some tactics for falling out of love with your idea?
Well, first of all, that's basically not going to happen. So that you could just give up hope. You're going to keep loving your idea forever. You're going to have to pivot, even while you still love it. Okay, it's like abandoning a child that you still love. It's actually really painful and unpleasant, and it doesn't actually get easy. Nothing that we're talking about will make that an easy or pleasant experience. In fact, only someone who is, on antidepressants or something would find this to be a pleasant experience. It really is a hard thing if you take it seriously. Because you have to admit that moment of crystal clarity that you had, you really saw the future, you knew it was going to be true. Nope, just kidding, you were wrong. It was the delusion. What we can do is get you to a point of realizing that you need to do this painful thing more quickly than the conventional method. That's the best we can do. And at the time that you do the pivot, try to give you some facts, some actual information that's true that you can use to make your decision based on. So one of the tips that both Ash and I have used a lot is to, if we acknowledge that we're going to have to pivot, that's an inevitable part of being an entrepreneur, then let's just schedule the meeting, the pivot or persevere meeting ahead of time. Let's put it on the calendar. And let's just say, okay, 6 or 8 weeks from now, and maybe every 6 or 8 weeks, we're going to have a meeting, and we're going to talk about, is it working? Is it not working? And what's awesome about that is, first of all, it really de-stresses the meeting, because it's not a big deal to raise the pivot specter. We do it regularly. But also, we can work backwards to say, well, what information would you want to have in the room at the time in order to know that you're making progress? It helps us identify those hypotheses and make those concrete predictions ahead of time. And the companies that I know that do this in a disciplined way, it is not easy. They do not fall out of love with their idea. They just admit that it's not working a little bit sooner. And then here's the great part. That part's the painful part. The nice part is everybody I meet who's just been through a pivot, every single one, wishes that they had done the pivot a little bit sooner. There's actually a huge relief in letting it go, because the cognitive dissonance between being in love with an idea and it not working actually takes a real psychic toll on people, and this actually does ultimately, I think, lead to both better outcomes and happier founders, but it involves a little pain along the way.
Thank you very much. All righty, looks like our next question is from Tim, and Tim would like to know, what is the best approach to identify individuals for customer development interviews? What tools, what networks could you recommend?
Well, I would say that the short answer is again, trying to identify, once you have your customers identified, try to go one level deeper and identify what might make an ideal early adopter. So really getting down into whether it's demographics, psychographics, but trying to get, there's some techniques that you see in the design world around personas, but trying to create those kinds of things. But the short answer of it is, once you have a clear kind of visual of who that customer is, you want to ask yourselves, where do they hang out? Where do they go? And those are often starting points to start that process. And I always challenge people, start with your 1-degree network. You can almost always find somebody that's a close enough match to that customer that you can start the conversation with. I also preface that by saying is that don't always listen to what your friends and family say, because depending on how they view entrepreneurship as a profession, they may dissuade or encourage you, and that may not be all that objective. So the idea of that is to really in some ways get the practice going, the juices flowing for getting the interviewing process started, but using that 1-degree network to find other people to go talk to. Now, in addition to that, there are a whole set of other techniques depending on the kinds of customer segments you're going after. I've seen many people have great success with tools like LinkedIn, using not just the warm introductions from people they know, but even doing a form of a cold call, but which is using their in-mail feature, but after they've had experience kind of nailing the customer problem. Once you can articulate something that's compelling, you can get one's attention and you can start that process. Now, I will say that in the very earliest stages, the goal isn't to go and find thousands of people to go interview if you're trying to build a product for thousands of customers or millions. You can get pretty good learning, pretty good significant learning from really a handful of the right types of customers. So if you're trying to charge for a product, for instance, and all 10 people you talk to say that they will never buy that product because they don't think there's any value in it, or the problem doesn't resonate with them, or the price is wrong, that's pretty significant. 10 people saying they don't want your product is pretty significant, and you can do all that learning with that qualitative sample, with that small sample, before you go on to that next stage.
Thank you, Ash. We do have another question here, and it's directed at Eric from Christian. Is the business model canvas, in your opinion, the key tool to aggregate key learnings as you test hypothesis? How critical is it to use a business model canvas?
That's a great question, and actually Ash has a lot more experience using the canvas than I do, to be honest. First of all, when I was actually practicing entrepreneur, this concept did not exist, and so there was no such thing. And very few of the companies that I work with use it as a tool. So I don't have that much to say about its value.
Sure.
The challenge I find in business modeling, specifically for startups, is I think that in order to really provide guidance about whether we're making progress, whatever tool we use to evaluate our strategy has to give us objective, and I think that means mathematical feedback about whether we're making progress, which goes back to the whole engines of growth and the thing in the book I call innovation accounting. Because I've yet to see an entrepreneur who can be dissuaded from their idea simply by reasoning about it. There's a lot of business strategy tools that can, when I get pitched, I often spend time with MBAs, and in fact I'm in Boston at the moment at HBS, and I sit with MBAs and listen to their ideas. Quite often the idea that they pitch is strategically unsound. It actually doesn't make sense. It doesn't, you do disruptive innovation correctly, or it doesn't, it has some kind of logical contradiction in it. It is, assumes that you can, work with kids, but it requires a large amount of money, from each customer, which kids don't have, or there's some kind of fundamental error. I can never actually win those arguments and convince people they've made a mistake. The only way I've ever seen an entrepreneur change their mind is through empirical testing. So any tool that gets people to test more quickly and more easily in order to find out if what they think is true or not, I think is a valuable tool.
Well,
thank you very much.
Maybe I'll just add like two things to that, and I'll kind of second that, and I see that I view the canvas as being part of a tool set. And again, I went into like implementations of these principles. The principles are, document your core hypotheses and then go empirically test them. And the canvas, what it does is it lets you kind of lay them out in a space-constrained format, so it gets you at least to put something down. Because one of the things that you oftentimes see is people just hold their hypotheses in their head, and that is truly the fastest way to iterate. You can change your mind every day. You're also not going to be very empirical about it. So I think that's one of those first attempts that I like to get people to do, is put something down on paper. Whatever you're thinking, just do a brain dump of it. But then that's just part of the tool. You really have to get out, and you have to go find evidence to back what's on there. And to the extent that you come and update it and keep it ongoing, that's again part of the discipline process. Some people do it, some people don't. But those I think are the core fundamentals.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Dan, and this one takes a little bit of a pivot from a business-focused question in that he'd like to know, Ash and Eric, what books are you both reading right now?
What am I reading? So the last book that I just finished, which is phenomenal, is a book called The Toyota Way to Lean Leadership. It's not a great title, to be totally honest, and it's there's a series of books by Dr. Jeff Liker about how Toyota does different aspects of their business. The first was a huge bestseller called The Toyota Way, and he's since done a series of follow-on books about specific aspects of the way Toyota operates. And because Lean has its roots in the Toyota production system, I'm totally fascinated by the work that these guys have done to document what happens at Toyota. And one of the biggest takeaways for me is that underlying all of Toyota's rapid testing and rapid, continuous improvement and driving down batches, all the process, the mechanical stuff that they're so good at, is an underlying philosophy of long-term value creation. And that is necessary. And it actually sets up this really interesting paradox that in order to build an institution that will last for the long term, you have to be willing to take these little actions in the short term. It requires both. And that's one of the things that has really influenced my thinking. And that's the last book that I think I actually finished cover to cover.
Well, I'll just say the one that I just started reading was the one that Eric recently sent, one that he recently posted about, which is The Founder's Dilemma.
Oh, that's a great
Dilemma book. Yeah, so I just picked that one up, and yeah, it was intriguing. It's written by, who's the author again, Eric?
His name is Noam Wasserman. He's actually one of my colleagues here at HBS.
Yes, from HBS.
Very cool.
And yeah, it seems to be a great read. It's anticipating and avoiding the pitfalls that can sink a startup. So I highly recommend it. I haven't gotten through it, but so far it's all good.
Thank you both so much for sharing that with all of us. We do appreciate it, and I'm sure Dan does too. Thank you, Dan, for that question. All righty, moving along here. Lots and lots of good questions. Our next one is from Zishan. Would it make sense to market directly to kids when selling children's books, apps, or should I market to parents who actually have purchasing power?
Yep, you sure should. Welcome to a multi-segment business. The more segments, the more stakeholders in the decision to purchase, the exponentially more difficult the business is. This is why kids' businesses are so especially difficult, is that you have to market to kids and parents at the same time. And the problem is that often what one segment wants is diametrically opposed to what the other segment wants. I speak as someone who spent a lot of time building a product that was used among many segments, but very passionately by a segment of 16 and 17-year-olds. And you can imagine that the very things that make a product extremely attractive to a 16-year-old might also make it extremely, unattractive to their parents. And so trying to find what is the way, how do you finesse that disagreement? How do you, get both customers to sign off? That's really hard, but you have to work on both simultaneously. That's been my experience.
Thank you very much. Let's take a peek here. Next one is from Michael. Michael asks, since learning comes from failure, what was your most recent failure that you learned from?
As Eric says, I think failure is par for the course, and we actually fail a lot every week. So I will say that, there was a question early on about what have you learned the most recently, and what we are spending a lot of time. So I've spent a lot of time practicing lean with a very small team, me and one other person. And now that the team is growing, we're running into more challenges about how we take kind of our practice on this more rigorous footing. So it's no longer just ideas in one or two people's minds, but they're now 5 or 6 people. And one of the things that we do is we have been running kind of these daily stand-ups and a weekly kind of pivot or persevere type lessons learned meeting. And so as part of that, I will say that every week we identify our key metric that we want to go achieve, and that's kind of our long-running goal. But every week we're trying to build a culture of experimenters, and so we all come up with bold hypotheses, whether they are ways to improve the activation flow or the experience, and things that we go and test, and oftentimes those things fail. So I will say there are a lot of failures along the way in search of the few that will actually give us that breakthrough in our numbers and in our learning.
Thank you, Ash. We have a really great question here from John. John asks, a lot of startups, Twitter for example, seem to suffer with scalability after a fast ramp up to get to market. How can the two be balanced?
One of the concepts, I was joking about the bumper sticker before. One of the concepts that before Lean Startup was really as popular as it is today, and the slogans and concepts from Lean Startup were as well known as they are now. One of the concepts I was trying to popularize without as much success is a concept called just-in-time scalability. And I actually believe, especially in the web world, that the right way to pursue scalability, but this is also true at an organizational level, is through incremental adaptive management that identifies what are the current bottlenecks and then very rapidly adjust to them. And there's really not a way to do this justice in the short time that we have, and I know we have some technical people on the call but some non-technical people, so I don't want to get into all the detail. There's quite a bit about this on my blog. But just to give you a flavor of it, when we were in the really rapid scaling growth curve in the early days of IMVU, IMVU is a product, it's used primarily on the weekends and at night, so it's on the Disney calendar. And that meant that when we would come into work on Monday, we'd be able to analyze our peak record usage, from the previous Saturday or Sunday. We were growing something like 15 or 20% a week, so it was very, very aggressive. And then we had a deadline. It's like, okay, any parts of our system that were about to fall apart, we had to get them, re-architected for scale by Friday. That's it. That's the deadline. We had 5 days. And so every week we would come in and systematically make our architecture a little bit more scalable week in, week out. And that often required making really risky, deep core changes to our architecture that most teams would be terrified to do in a month or a year, let alone every week. But we were so good at, because we did continuous deployment, we had the cluster immune system, we had all these techniques for detecting errors and preventing them, that if we did make a mistake, the consequences of failure were really small, and so we could act with courage. And what that meant is that, for months, week in, week out, we could make our system a little bit more scalable, each week without causing major problems. And that actually continues to be how IMVU runs even to this day.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have a question now from Jake. What are the best roles and duties for non-technical, non-developer type people in a lean startup?
I know Eric kind of has talked about this as well in the past, but I do believe in creating cross-disciplinary teams, and so even though you may be non-technical, I think we're moving away from a culture of of extreme specialization to one where we're trying to build more cross-disciplinary, smaller teams. So I do think that depending on what skills you're bringing in, it's best to be paired up with someone that can actually build the product. And Eric has talked about in the past about problem teams and solution teams. I think if the team is small enough, it can still be one team. But some of the roles that kind of naturally fall into places for non-technical folks are things like getting outside the building and learning from customers. Now, I do think that is exclusively just for them, but I find that that's something that they'd be more naturally inclined to doing. But I would say that learning at the end, learning from customers specifically, is really everyone's responsibilities. And so whether you're doing that explicitly by going out and soliciting learning from customers directly, face-to-face, over the phone, other means, or you're doing it through analytics and instrumentation in the product, which would be people doing that inside the building, it's still everyone's responsibility. And I think the culture that I see where this stuff works is one where there aren't really those titles or really those boundaries about what people do, but there is this transparency about what the what really creates that customer value, and taking that to that and using that to guide the kinds of experiments, the kinds of things that the team builds.
I think that's really
great answer. Mm-hmm. Alrighty, folks, let's take a peek here. Questions are still coming in. Again, folks, please send in your questions while we have these gentlemen with us. This is your one and only chance to have that time to ask them your questions. So type them into the group chat. Keep them coming. Alrighty, here's a really good one directed at you, Eric. It's from Benjamin. Benjamin says, you say to cut your feature list in half when building the MVP. Do you think there are some genuinely good ideas that simply won't appeal without the full feature set?
Well, thank you for the question, Benjamin. That's not actually what I say. What I say is to cut your feature list in half and then cut it in half again. So you're off by an order of two. And of course I say that a little bit facetiously because we generally tend to fall in love with features. And the premise of this question, it's the premise that's actually the problem, not the question itself. I want to really attack this premise. The premise is that there's a set of ideas out there that if we had more features, customers would like them, but with too few features, they won't like them. And the basic idea is that customers prefer more features. And this is simply not true. Now, the problem is customers really only care about a small number of key features. We just don't know which they are. So the more features we add, I think the reasoning goes, the more likely we will hit upon that one key feature. But that doesn't work either, because the problem is that the more features we have, the more cluttered our user interface, the more confusing our product, the more difficult it is for customers to understand what they can do with the product, and the more experimentation it requires on the part of customers to figure out how to make it work for them. Now, some early adopters are really willing to do that experimentation, so it's okay. If you don't want to do what I'm saying, you say, I don't want to cut my feature list in half, I want to ship with all the features, okay. You got to do what you got to do. You're the entrepreneur, you make the decision. But I think that it's likely that the more features you have, the less information you'll get from the release. And if you look at the really breakthrough products, and everyone's talking about Instagram right now, there were a million other products that did what Instagram did and also a bunch of other stuff. And those products could not get any kind of traction because doing one thing well is much better in an MVP. You learn much better if you just do one thing well, even if other things are atrophied or missing. And, you know, the other way to think about it is, what's the consequence of shipping with too few features? I know so many entrepreneurs that are terrified of shipping with too few features, and I think what they're afraid of is they're going to put the product out there, and some customer is going to try it, not like it, and write them a nasty email. Dear entrepreneur, you idiot, I can't believe you launched this thing and it only has features X and Y but not feature Z, which is so important. But that's actually a great outcome. That's like one of the best things that can happen to you as an entrepreneur. Trust me, as someone who's had much worse things happen to me, that's great. That means customers care. They agree with you about the key features. They're willing to take time to try the product, and then they care enough to write you about it. That's really good news. Most of the time when you ship a new product, nobody even tries it. So it certainly doesn't matter how many features it has. And so even if you're planning to ship a product with 10 features, you may as well ship it first with 5 just to double check that customers hate it as much as you do. Because if something different happens, you might be pleasantly surprised.
Thank you, Eric. Great answer there. We have our next question from Barry. Barry would like to know, do you have any examples of application of lean in healthcare?
In healthcare? I don't, Eric, do you?
Whenever I get on the spot here by industry, I have to be careful because I have to review. There's a lot of stuff there's a lot of things I know that I'm not allowed to say because I learn a lot about companies that's under NDA. So the answer is yes, but I'm trying to think what actual stories I can tell you. I'll tell one story. I won't name the company, but I used to say when I was talking about these ideas, especially when I first learned about customer development, I used to say, and so did a bunch of other people, that, well, if you're working on a cure for cancer, don't worry about this. Because, you know, if you're working on a cure for cancer, it's pretty obvious that customers will want the product and don't worry about it. But I met a company that was doing a cancer diagnostic. They had this amazing technology in the lab that could do early detection of cancerous cells. And they had to make a decision about which kind of cancer they should pursue to actually build their first product. And they did a little strategic analysis, you know, for all I know, replete with a business model canvas, and came up with a really good idea, which was, let's go after the biggest cancer market we could find, which I believe at the time was breast cancer. So they built a device for early detection of breast cancer. But then it turned out that doctors would not use it, because although their detection was better than the conventional one, there were actually already existing products in the market that doctors viewed as good enough, and they couldn't get them to change their behavior to this different product. Plus, the price point was different. It meant different margins. It was actually like quite a difficult sale, and the company almost died because no doctors would use the actual diagnostic. But luckily, you know, they realized in time that they had to pivot, and they noticed that in certain other cancers, much more rare cancers, there were no diagnostics available at all. There simply was no tools available. So there was actually an empty opportunity. And they made the pivot into, now I can't remember what the actual cancer was, something quite obscure. And they were able to find their initial traction, and they actually were off to the races, and they did well. And I love that example because you would think if you had a tool that could help people identify cancer, you'd be done. But guess what? Even in those environments, you still have to really understand what your hypotheses are and just, you know, double check that they're right.
Thank you very much, Eric. Questions are coming in strong. All righty, next one is from Christian. In which areas do you think the lean methodology needs to make progress in the future? Where is the methodology going?
Maybe I'll take a stab, and I'd love for Eric to kind of chime in on this because he sees more of that. But I still think that we're kind of just at the cusp of all this. We've just scratched the tip of the iceberg. We've got these great principles out. Eric Ries and Steve Blank in kind of the early days helped to really mobilize a bunch of people with whom these ideas resonated. And now the real challenge starts, which is taking this stuff to practice. And what I see, I give these workshops, and at the end of it, I find people, some of them inspired, come up to me and said, thank you for this, and I'm going to go and apply these tomorrow. And I follow with them in a few days, and I ask them what's going on. And sure, they tried one or two things, but then it's back to business as usual. Old habits really die very hard. I think, in my mind, that is one of the biggest obstacles that we have to eventually work towards overcoming here. And Eric, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We are in the very early days of this. When people look back on our time decades from now, I am confident that they're going to laugh in our face at the way that we do new product development and entrepreneurship today. They're going to be like, they didn't even know, the same way that we look back on people 100 years ago. You go back to the early machine shops and factories where the very first management methods, what we would now recognize as management, what they called scientific management, were developed. I mean, these were companies that produced multiple different products at multiple different price points, and they didn't even know which products were profitable and which ones weren't, because they didn't have modern statistics or the concept of marginal profit. I mean, they really didn't have the accounting methods necessary to figure out what the hell they were doing. When I read stories like that, I can't help but be like, what primitive, foolish, incompetent managers they were. But the truth is that they were just at the beginning of a revolution that took almost 100 years to really transform how work is done. So we are the inheritors of that movement, and we have a similar opportunity to change the way work is done in the next century. And so, we are in year 2 or 3 of what I think is going to be a multi-decade journey of figuring out what works. And so, for everyone who's listening on the call, don't be like the people Ash was talking about. Don't be momentarily inspired and say, oh, that was entertaining, and then go back to your regular job and just do things the old way. I really encourage everybody to think, just take a moment right now, and just think of one thing that you could do. It doesn't have to be something huge. It could be one small thing you were inspired to change in your business, but something that you could do tomorrow, in one day, just to make a first step towards actually getting something done. And then, let that be the first step on, hopefully a long journey of discovery. And I hope that in the future, Ash and I will be tuned into your webcast as we learn what worked for you and what didn't. Because what we need are practitioners to test these ideas. Tell us what works, tell us how to refine them, and teach the next generation of people. So I hope many of you will take us up on that offer. It's the job of people like Ash and I to make people like you famous. So if you manage to learn something new, even if what you learn is that what we're saying makes no sense, we want to tell everybody about that. We want that to be widely known because we all want the truth about what actually improves the state of the art in entrepreneurship.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric. Folks, our time is starting to wind down here. We have time for just one more question, just one more. We'll ask it real quick here. It's from Tom. Tom would like to know, do you think engineers and project managers that are over 50 years old can adapt to lean thinking? What about people that have worked in large companies?
Not only do I think that is true, but I know it for sure. Yeah. And I have 2 data points to share. I'll share them briefly. One is if you look at the data on entrepreneurship, older entrepreneurs actually do better on average than younger entrepreneurs. So the idea that you have to be, 20 years old at Harvard to be a successful entrepreneur is just, empirically speaking, not true. And I now, because of the book, I get to work with a lot of entrepreneurs in established companies, including in some of the world's largest companies and even some in government. And I have met true entrepreneurs of all ages in all contexts. And if you want to be really inspired about people doing lean in an unusual way, if you sign up online, I can't remember where it is, but I know if you sign up for my newsletter, I'm sure you'll get it. I'll send an email to everybody. We're just waiting for the video from South by Southwest. We had the Chief Technology Officer of the United States, Todd Park, talking about some of the projects they've done using Lean Startup inside the federal government, like in the Center for Medicare. Okay, so for Medicare, something like a $500 billion budget. And if they can use these ideas, I really believe that means anybody can. Anyway, but I know a lot of people are going to be skeptical and be like, no, that can't be right. I know. I was skeptical, too, when I first heard the story. If you watch the video, you got to hear the actual level of detail that he's willing to talk about what they're really doing and judge for yourself. And we haven't quite got it online, but I think it's going to be online in the next couple of days, so we're working on that. So hope that will be helpful.
On that, too, I'd just like to add that I often like to say that lean is fundamentally about reducing waste, and I often find that you can't really appreciate that unless you've been wasteful first. So, irrespective of age, I do find that the more experience you've had, in many ways, you kind of are able to recognize waste a lot more quickly and at least get over that initial, do these ideas resonate, do they make sense, and actually move more towards action. So that's what I'll add to that.
Great. Gentlemen, with that, we're going to say a very big thank you to both of you for spending your time with us today, for sharing all your knowledge and expertise with us. Folks who attended today's event, we hope you benefited, and we thank you all for attending. We'd like to let you all know Ash's book, Running Lean, is the O'Reilly deal of the day. That means you can get it today at a great price. Visit O'Reilly.com. Look on the right-hand side. You'll see it right there. It's the O'Reilly deal of the day. If you like what you heard today, you need to get the book. It's got lots more great tips for you all in there. Again, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Ash. This will conclude today's webcast.
Hey, thank you very much. Thanks, Ash. Always good to talk to you.
Thanks, Eric.
Goodbye, everybody.